In this video we have target and pole controllers, pretty well known and fairly simple to get to grips with, but there are a few little details that are worth taking note of because they will rear their ugly heads later on. So what we have are these simple options. We can take a target item, also known as an aim constraint in other packages, and set it for something, and also a pole item. The thing that we've set will then always aim at or target the target item, whilst its roll direction will point toward the pole item. Put in terms of rotations, then the point here for the heading and pitch axis will always point towards the target, and the one for the bank axis will point toward the pole. Another way of looking at it in terms of the object's own local space, its local orientation, is to remember the relation to the local axis, the direction vectors of the item. It's forward along the positive Z here, which always points to the target. It's up along the positive Y that always points to the pole. Hence why this is sometimes called an up vector, because it determines the direction from the object's origin at which its up vector will be aligned. The first gotcha with target item comes in what happens when we're deciding to use target item on only one axis. So let's say I do it with just the heading in this case, and so like this he will point round in this fashion, but he will not pitch up or down. We can see that he works all nice and reliably there. He's pointing where he should, he just doesn't care about the up and down. However, let's consider that we were doing him only on pitch. Then clearly in the top view here, he's not swinging round on his heading, he doesn't care about it. Whilst on his pitch, he is indeed going for it. What we now get is a problem where if this is moved off axis, so along on the X here, the pitch starts to dip, even though looking at it in the side view here, we should assume it should not. This effect is caused by our Euler rotations and the fact that they are ordered rotations. The heading is in effect the parent of the pitch, and as such the target needs to work on the axes in these order in order to come out with the correct overall rotation. So it does expect both heading and pitch rotation if it is to calculate the correct pitch rotation, or rather it will always calculate the pitch as would befit the heading if it were turned on. Even though he seems to dip incorrectly when we come off to the side with him like this, when we turn him back to point at target for heading, then we can see that with the combination of axes he is targeted on the item quite correctly. Another thing to take note of is the play of the Euler domain constraint that was mentioned back in the foundations video on rotations. If we come again to having the pitch set to point at target and the heading not, then when we come up in this regard we'll see that everything's great, but once we get to 90 degrees he starts going back down again until he winds up pointing completely the wrong way, and then he grabs again at the inside 90 degrees. This behaviour again comes from the ordered rotations and the way that Euler coordinates work, and specifically how, when aligning themselves to an external world space as it were, which is sort of what target and pole items are. They're contained in a space outside of this object, so its rotations have to be calculated in the sense of the world, how it points overall from where it is to where they are, given its parent space and what have you. How this works when both heading and pitch are turned on for the target, however, is that when we reach 90 degrees, we get this flip. The pitch has gone up to 90 degrees and then it's coming back down to 0 degrees, but the heading does an instant little flip over there. So as it comes back down on the other side, and we get this continuous target behaviour. This whole thing gives us one of the reasons to have pole items in use, because the heading is doing the flip when the pitch reaches 90 degrees, which is the point of gimbal lock for the heading and bank. So if you can adjust the bank at the same time as the heading, you get a counter flip. For the minute it appears to be no different, we still get this flip, but we get it at a different point. Specifically we get it at the point where our target item crosses this imaginary line between our pole and the item's centre over here. Crossing the pole line causes the flip to happen. The way that you prevent the flip is by animating both your target and your pole, and in this fashion, whilst always keeping your target on the correct side of the pole line, you are able to come round and perform perfect, seemingly flipless motions and targets on things. There is a small trick though, because it is not truly flipless. If we look at our item's rotation here, we can see that he is flipped at this point 180 on his heading and negative 180 on his bank. So there is still a single frame flip that occurs on two channels. That can be of concern with things if you're rendering motion, blur and the like. This is one reason why it's also often important at the end of animation to break everything down to FK keyframes and then Euler filter, to take out all of these jumps after the fact. Otherwise, target and pole in this sense really are just ways of constraining the two local vectors of an item or an object so as they always align to that sort of world direction from its own centre to those points of target and pole. And like this, you can manage your alignments and keep the rig turning and pivoting exactly the right way round without things flipping. One of the choices in our rigging that is impacted by the way all of this works will be how we set up rotation orders for things. For instance, take this oft-used example of targeting where you have sort of a gun turret platform with a turning gun barrel part of this nature. This only wants to turn around, in this case heading, and this only wants to pivot up and down, in this case pitch. So whilst we would target both at the target item, we would do the base in heading only, the gun only for pitch, and we'd see that it all works out just fine. Everything targets as it's supposed to. The reason this works, of course, is owing to the fact that we have replicated the rotation order here. The rotation order is very much like the axes being parented to one another. So here we have an object that turns only on its heading, and then its immediate child turns only on its pitch. It's exactly the same as if we used a single item with heading and pitch both set to target. As it happens in this example, by default, the heading is the axis that we would want to turn this base on. But if this were at the end of a chain somewhere and had wound up with its pitch going round that way, we would want to correct for that. However, it is worth noting that you could have reoriented this item to have its up-down also on heading. Then, by having both items point at target in heading, the thing still works. You get exactly the same result. It's reliable. The reason, of course, is because heading always works, irrespective of how the target item is moved off plane, as it were. And so compacting multiple heading targets together like this will always work as well. And it can work out as a pretty good alternative, because the one thing that you don't need to do with it is to define a pole. Your item will always be oriented around the side that it is on. And this kind of setup can get you out of a few problem situations that can otherwise occur when confronted with some of the limits imposed by the Euler axis system. So there we have it, the target and pole system. Pretty simple really, but important to understand to make sure that you're always getting predictable results.